All right, welcome back to the Jiu-Jitsu Mindset. My name is Pete Deeley, and my partner in crime, Professor Lucas Rubbo, may be joining us a little bit later, but for now, it's just me. And uh, as you guys know, when we start off, we talk about our submission coffee, and we have a big competition weekend for those of us in Arizona. And so far, submission coffee has not been identified as a performance enhancing drug. So we would want to encourage you to go to submissioncoffee.com and give our coffee a try. We have had some extraordinary people on as of late, people who have been at the top of their game. And today we're really lucky to have another person that has been at the top of the game in a variety of different ways. As I was researching our guest, I saw him described as the most accomplished American grappler of his time, America's jiu-jitsu superhero. He has all these amazing accomplishments, is a world champion at IBJJF and ADCC, an entrepreneur, an author, and a filmmaker. He's coached some of the most important people in fighting. But when I asked him, how do you want to be introduced, with great humility, he's the father and coach of my great accomplishments. So today we're very lucky to have Professor Robert Drysdale with us. And so, Professor, thank you for making time for us. We're really grateful that you're here to talk with us.
Thank you, man. Thank you, PT, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you for all the kind words, man. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Well, we the people that are listening to us are here. We're not like a podcast that's breaking down a lot of techniques or talking about the mechanics of jiu-jitsu as much as we're talking about jiu-jitsu as it affects your life off the mats, and how important it is to people, training as a way to improve the rest of their lives. And when I was looking at the various things you've accomplished, your relationship to jiu-jitsu seems to be very wide-ranging. You have all of this physical relationship as a practitioner and coach, but you have an intellectual relationship to it, it appears to me, as well as an author, where you've really spent a lot of time and energy teaching, as well. And so I thought we would start there as well. You've written a couple of books and the history of jiu-jitsu and the breaking down of opening the closed guard, I think, is the second book that I came across. And I wanted to ask you, what was the impulse to take your love of jiu-jitsu into writing? And then, what was your experience in that way as an author?
Oh, those two big. I mean, I think the first one is a short one. The second one is a big answer. So I think the interest is I've always had, other than a passion for combat. When I was a kid, it was everything was G.I. Joe and He-Man.
Okay.
It looked like your
Yeah.
generation. You know what I'm talking about,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
G.I. Joe and He-Man had to do with a sword, a gun, a shield, or a hammer or something.
Yeah.
And I was really into cars and kites, when I was a child. And and then the other one was I always enjoyed reading. I've always had, I think my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, got me in the habit of reading, and I
Nice.
always enjoyed reading comic books first, and then books,
Right.
and it was always a habit. I always drifted towards the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
Some, what I think one point I was pretty convinced I was going to be an archaeologist when I grew up. I
Wow.
wasn't really thinking about being a fighter or a coach, but so I think these at some point, once my career ended, and I retired, that those two passions came together. It was just, when you think about it, it's pretty. The only thing that's surprising is that didn't happen sooner. I was
Okay.
never interested in the history of jiu-jitsu. It just never even occurred to me
Right.
until after retirement. Like, oh man, I should probably learn something. I wonder how this happened. And all this time reading about all these other things have nothing to do with jiu-jitsu. Why not read about what I make a living from?
Right.
And then when I found the books by Roberto Pedreira, Shocky Volume 1, 2, and 3,
Okay.
and that there open all these doors. That was a catalyzer to really get me going. And but as far as the experience, man, almost so much, man. Lots of ups, lots of downs, mostly downs.
Right.
But I think the two books standing, the opening closed guard and the rise and evolution of BJJ,
Right.
I think they're testaments of that I'm not a quitter, man. Because when I look back, it's like, man, it's actually the last 6-7 years have been a roller coaster
Right.
of dealing with people and making time to write and just editing these books and diagramming them and dealing with the documentary. It's been quite the roller coaster. I have lost money on this. There's no way that I've made money on this. And the books sell well. They both sell every day well, from other people who, are in the book industry. And I tell them how many copies we sold. They're like, man, that's incredible. Like that's way better than most books are ever going to do, right? But at the same time, the amount of time and energy I put into it, had I just put that into making money, I probably would have made a lot. But it was never about that with me. It was just like, man, this story is incredible. And however great Shockey is as a historical reference, it's a very heavy read, and most people can't finish it. They're dense. They're not for everyone. It's a book for historians, really. It's not really a book for the average reader. So, and then people didn't know about it, but it's all there. It's all recorded. These are facts. They're not, opinions.
Right.
And so I thought first of a documentary, and then because the documentary was taking so long, I wrote a book. And then after some time, I'm like, man, I really didn't get to say everything I wanted to say in that first book. I should probably write it. It turned out to be longer than the first, but yeah.
Well, I mean, delving into something that you had such practical knowledge of, like you have a relationship with it as a practitioner. When you have this relationship as a historian and as a teacher, as somebody who's sort of internalizing this information in a way that you're going to express it through words rather than teach somebody something, by moving their body. Did it change your relationship to jiu-jitsu in terms of like your physical relationship to it?
I wouldn't say physical problem. It made me rethink. So, for example, when I teach now, I have a better understanding of jiu-jitsu's evolution, its technical evolution, so I can see a genealogy.
Okay.
Like, for example, why people back in the day passed on their knees, why they stopped doing it, and why they're back to doing it now. So most competitors are completely unaware of this because they're not interested in the genealogy of it. They're just interested in what is it that, what do I have to do to win, which is sensible, right? Most practitioners kind of. But as a coach and as a historian, like, this is interesting to me. It's like, oh, so people used to pass on their knees because they had to hold their opponents down, and it was better for ground and pound because they used to train with slaps back in the day.
Right.
And then once the slaps were removed, passing standing made a lot more sense, made it a lot more dynamic. But then guys got so good at the lahiva and attacking the leg, because a lot of people going back to their knees. So, it makes me have a new relationship to jiu-jitsu that I think most people don't have. It's the way I describe this to people. It's like kind of like watching a movie black and white and watching it with color.
Right.
It's the same movie, but if you have IMAX, it's not. It's just a better experience than black and white will be. So that's what it's done for me. It's made me appreciate jiu-jitsu in a whole new way that made it. I think it's just enriched the art, really, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, you're having such an impact on people at in the practical way as a training and coaching, and that deep knowledge of why things are the way they are now, I think is also that allows for the advancement of the art, because your knowledge of why are we doing this at this particular moment. Everything that's old is new again at some point in time. Like, we're on our knees, we're off our knees, we're on, and that's sort of back and forth. Well, you've been saved by having to only talk to me, by Professor Lucas Rubbo has joined us. So not the brains and the beauty of the podcast is back online here. So, Professor,
I'm back, yeah.
Thanks for I know you had a little bit of internet trouble, so we've been talking a little bit of just about Professor Drysdale's being an author, and sort of that journey. And the last little bit of the conversation was about its effect on him. And I know you had some real specific questions about that journey as well. Let me turn the floor to you real quick.
For sure. Professor Robert, first of all, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm a big fan of yours. Following your competitive career, I started training in 2003. So that was like you're doing everything on that time, and fighting against the best and having like amazing results. And now also being like an amazing coach and author. It's been so awesome to keep following you. So thank you so much for everything that you do for the community. I have that curiosity on knowing, I don't know if you guys already talk a little bit about that, but did you always have that curiosity about jiu-jitsu history? Like, what brought you to start searching then that in a deeply way where you could like write a book, and I believe you have a documentary coming up. What was your ideas? You know, what's your beliefs when you started making all that research?
Yeah, well, it was, I mean, remember the question was, I tell this story in the book, but it was a simple question. It was like a student of mine asked me why I didn't have all the framed pictures on the wall like every gym has. And my answer was like, man, I never studied, I don't know anything about jiu-jitsu history, really. And then my student goes, but Rob, aren't you a history major? And I'm like, yeah, I should probably know something about jiu-jitsu. You know, it's kind of embarrassing. It's like, yeah, man, I never really, you know, that was right around the time of retirement too. So I mean, was good. And I love investigating, man. Like I love putting pieces together. I love thinking about something from multiple angles and trying to figure out why, interpret it, why was it like this and not like that. You know, there's a lot of gaps in this story that I noticed. Like, you know, anyone who's been, you've seen footage of jiu-jitsu in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you saw these guys like slapping each other, you saw them kicking each other. All the pictures of Helio throwing kicks, and like, we don't do any of that. Like, how can they, you know, it's like, so we're talking about Brazilian jiu-jitsu and we trace it back to Helio and Carlos and the Gracie Academy, but all these unanswered questions, it's like what they were doing, something completely different from what we're doing today. Now we're calling it jiu-jitsu, we're using the same word, but it's clearly not the same thing. So I always had these questions in the back of my mind, and you know, being able to dig in a little bit more, like you can start making sense of what the reasons why these changes occurred and when they occurred, and they have a background. Like it's cultural, it's technical, it's personal. It's the rivalry between Helio and Carlson was something I think most people completely miss because it's such a politically loaded topic, but I don't realize how important that was for the evolution of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's one of the most significant events in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history. The rule set, I mean, one of my favorite chapters in my new book is chapter 8, right? And I trace the evolution of the rule set from 1936 to 54 to 67 to 75. And then in 75, you pretty much have the IBJJF system with minor modifications. But how they got there in 75, it seems like it's something insignificant, but you can clearly see them drifting away from judo in a slow motion. And it wasn't a quick process. So if there's any doubt that Carlos and Healy were doing judo, I think that the rules end that discussion. There's no, I mean, in the 1954 rule set, it was an in-house tournament inside the Gracie Academy. You have Vazari, Osaikomi, and Ippon in the rule set. What else do you need to know? Like it's in the rule, you know, and then in 67 you see minor modifications. They remove the Vazari and the Osaikomi. They don't have those two anymore. So it's and then they're getting a point for mount and a point for the back, right? And then in 75, there's this huge leap. 4 points for the back, 4 points for mount, 4 advantages for mount, 2 points for near submissions, only 2 points for takedown. Like, so if you had to identify a moment where it became a ground-oriented art, it's 1975, which is way later than what most people had understood it to be. Most people had an idea that Maeda taught like a more ground-oriented version of jiu-jitsu, so they had this since the 1920s, and it's not true, you know. So they took 45 years essentially to get to a ground-oriented version of jiu-jitsu, and I can't prove this, okay? So I didn't put it in the books. I'm speculating here, but everything to believe that had to do with Carlson Gracie. I think he was the determining factor there, and it's an underplayed character because he had one son and not someone who's a marketer. So you know, a lot of things about his life and what he did for jiu-jitsu got buried, you know, because the people who got to tell BJJ history were of the Helio Gracie side of the feudal war. That civil war between the two, they were all on the Helio side, so they told that version of events. But when you talk to some of these old timers who are still in Brazil, they're like, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. So you get a very different interpretation of events. So all these things, like, and jiu-jitsu makes so much more sense to me now. And I really wish that people in the present who are just, you know, they just live on Instagram and that's the extent of experience outside. Like, man, they make this much more of an effort. And I promise you, it's going to enrich your jiu-jitsu practice so much. But if people don't believe you, because they look at a book and they go, oh, here we go. They don't want to do it, you know, because they want to do something else with their time. But I'm telling you, it's worth the effort. I'm always trying to convince people to read Shockey. But it's such a hard read. But I've read those books cover to cover 3 times. I love it, but I mean, they are heavy reads, so anyway, that's just me. But I love stuff, man. I can talk about this all day.
That's awesome. I saw you talk a little bit about that rivalry between the family on starting right on that time between Elio and Carson. Yeah. And I believe I saw you somewhere, and correct if I'm wrong, that Carson Gracie is your favorite Gracie.
Yeah.
Is that true? Like, can you explain a little bit why?
Well, he was always, when I started training, Royce was my hero. Till this day, in fact, I've trained 6 UFC champions. I've met everyone worth meeting in MMA and BJJ. I never get starstruck, except when I see Royce. Every time I see him, I get goosebumps. Holy cow, that's crazy. It's like, to me, when I sit down to interview Royce, the only interview I was nervous about with the Royce one, because like, holy shit, that's Royce Gracie right in front of me. He was a hero of my youth, when I started. But once I started understanding jiu-jitsu better, all the best jiu-jitsu representatives in the world were out of Carlson's gym. So to me, this is a matter of logic. Like, if you look at the best MMA representatives in the history of BJJ, like 9 out of 10 come out of Carlson's gym. And what else do you need to know? Like, this guy's the best coach, clearly. And then once you learn something about him as a fighter, you realize he was the most successful fighter in the family in MMA till this day. There's no one as successful as Carlson. And not only that, he fought the best guys in his era. It was never picking fights, none of that, like heavier guys. And people don't know MMA history, but guys like Ivan Gomez and Euclides Pereira, that's like fighting John Jones to a draw. That's what we're talking about here, being like 20 pounds lighter, 30 pounds lighter. It's incredible, as a fighter. And then you get to learn about Carlson as a human, as a person. And then you like him even more. It's like, man, this guy, not a single street fight. Everyone loved him, even the Luta Livre guys. The Luta Livre guys had this huge rivalry. There's that one event, I think it was Carlson Jr. talks about it, when the Luta Livre guys invaded a jiu-jitsu tournament in 1990, and they had guns on. They're all carrying guns. Like, these guys went there to pick a fight, and then they wanted to get into it with the jiu-jitsu guys, and they said the people were trying to calm them down. The only person they would talk to is Carlson. Why? It's the only one they respected. And then Carlson said, "You guys want to fight? Take your guns home. Let's fight. Let's set up a time, and we're going to do an event." And that was the 1991 challenge between Jiu-Jitsu and Luta Livre, which essentially inspired the UFC.
Wow.
So yeah, it's super interesting stuff, man. Carlson, man, I was talking to one of his students the other day. He would let homeless people sleep inside his gym. That was Carlson. Like, he would let people train for free. He'd be wearing a watch, and you would say something, "Hey, man, that's a nice watch." He'd take it off and give it to you.
I heard multiple stories like that as well.
He was just like this disinterested person, absolutely committed to jiu-jitsu, its evolution, his students. It was never about money and popularity with them. It was just about evolving the art. And I felt he was a great model for jiu-jitsu, because I think we lack that. So Carlson became a reference to me personally.
One thing that's been interesting to me, Professor Drysdale, is like the distance between Elio and the people that you're mentioning and us, like, currently, is not so far that the ability to go and talk to people and have first person like conversations with the sources of people either observe these things or were a part of these things is still available to us. And I mean, obviously this sport will continue to grow, and there'll come a time where that won't be as obvious. When I listen to your investigation of these things and your pronunciation in Portuguese, it's clear that you're comfortable and integrated into the Brazilian world. But we're curious about, like, being an American jiu-jitsu student, jiu-jitsu practice. What was that like, particularly early on? What was that experience like? Was it a welcoming experience? Was there suspicion? Like, you seem to kind of crash into a world that might not have been either ready and maybe I'm making some assumptions about that, but we're curious about that.
I had a good idea of that, I was going to make some enemies throughout this, but at the same time, I feel like, man, if my intentions are good, and I know they are, I'm not really. I think my disagreements and my clash with some of these guys, it's a methodological one. It's not a political one. I don't have a political stance in this, other than my admiration for Carlson. I think that's a bias. My love for jiu-jitsu is a bias.
Right.
But other than that, man, like it's not, I don't think I'm really invested in this or that. I mean, I get called anti-Brazilian all the time in Brazil, and I get called anti-American over here too. So it's just like either I'm crazy or you guys aren't, just drawing like these broad conclusions, with not really, bothering reading the books,
Yeah.
But I think the people that read the books, or one of them at least, they tend to like, see where I'm coming from and go and, sort of like support me. Right. And
Right.
that's been very encouraging. The first one, especially, I think the response was very positive from those who read the book, and it was very negative by those who didn't.
Okay.
So
Right. Yes.
that tells everything I need to know right there. So I'm happy with those results.
Right.
Of course, most people didn't read it. So now, because the tide is starting to turn and a lot of people who read the book do support me, I think that the people who haven't read it now are divided between those who dislike me and the book and those who are neutral about it, kind of suspicious and kind of confused, because they were certain it was one thing, but the people who read the book are saying something else. So I think that, I think over time, and it might take another, who knows, another 10 years, the tide will change. And I think people are going to Robert is actually making some sense here. Not that I'm the first one to make sense in this story. Again, there are
Right.
people who precede me in this investigation, but I think that that's a good thing. That's what we want. You're not going to change, 50, 60, 100 years of a narrative in a couple years. It's just not going to happen. But I think over time, people will see jiu-jitsu history in a wealthier light, the one we currently have. Because I really think that the actual events are far more interesting than the more, embellished version of events.
Yeah, truth is always stranger than fiction, right? Isn't that the expression? As a competitor, though, early on, in terms of being an American in, a sport that might have been dominated earlier in your career, by Brazilians, was being an American, did it matter in those days? I mean, were you accepted or not accepted as a competitor differently for being American?
It's strange. It's a good question. I was born in the U.S. I was born in Utah.
Right.
My parents moved to Brazil when I was 6.
Okay.
So I was fluent in Portuguese when I moved to Brazil. They threw me in school, and school was hell.
Okay.
The first
Is your parents Brazilian or they just moved there?
My mom's Brazilian.
Okay.
My mom's Brazilian. My dad's American. So my mom wanted to move back to Brazil. So I was raised in Brazil as a child. So,
Okay.
I'm getting picked on every day. I'm getting into fights every other day. I learned how to speak Portuguese. When I moved there, it wasn't, I spoke a little because my mom spoke with me. I couldn't understand it. I remember having a lot of problems in school, catching up with the kids and making friends and all that. But eventually I sort of became situated and climatized, and I made friends. And so the people in jiu-jitsu always treated me as my friends from the gym, maybe a little bit different, just like, with this guy, but like not like nothing that, but definitely at tournaments and places I went to, people would see my name, they'd look at me and they try to speak English to me or something. I'm like, no, I speak Portuguese,
Yeah.
So this is what happened. This is why when people give like Brazilian referees a hard time saying that they're like, oh, they're biased against Brazilians, like there's no person that can claim that they have competed more I know there's no Americans competed more in Brazil than me. No one, not even close.
Right.
I mean, if you put Lovato, Alberto Crane, and like some of others like Jake McKenzie together, like maybe, like I was competing for like a decade, like every other weekend kind of thing,
Right.
So, and I never felt that they were biased against me because I was American. I never, the referees didn't know me. Like my friends knew, they felt I was Brazilian, but the referees didn't know that.
Right.
I never felt that. I mean, I've been screwed plenty of times, but I never felt it was because you were born, the Rio Grande. I don't believe it. I never bought it. I hear people saying that all the time, and it's a common complaint.
Right.
But I don't buy it. I really don't.
And you know that time was different, right? Nowadays, if you compete on IBJJF, have your name like a flag that represent or something. On that time was you, the referee, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right? They barely gonna say your name and go from there. But did you have a feeling where like when you won the world championship, ADCC, being like a non-Brazilian, kind of I would say like half Brazilian, half America, like you had the feeling that that was a big news on the jiu-jitsu community, or was it just like something normal?
I know BJ was the first You know, I knew actually technically the first non-Brazilian to win a world title was João Hockey in '96. A lot of people don't know João Hockey was born in Angola. Yeah, but so technically, really, BJ's the second. I'm the third. But at the time, everyone thought BJ was the first, and that was a big deal. So when I won in 2005, I knew of it, but I mean, here's the thing, man. I've never been one for marketing. I just don't think about it. I could have marketed that better. Like, you can really get anything, and if you keep saying, you make it sound.
Yeah, right.
No, literally, like sometimes I see some of these people marketing some of these, like, that doesn't even mean anything. Like, why are you even? But they're bragging about it like it's an achievement, you know?
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like, I feel like the world title was the achievement. Like, who cares when I was born? Like, why does that matter? And it doesn't, you know. Like, I mean, we like to say the thing. I think it's descriptive of how jiu-jitsu was spreading from Brazil to the world. That now we have so many people from other nationalities winning world titles. Right, like as it grows around the world, you just watch. In the next 10 years, we're gonna watch all these guys in Dagestan winning BJJ world titles. Mark my words.
And that,
they're gonna take over. Just watch me. But you know, like to me, that's not. It's only the thing that you know you can be said about that is although these places have different cultures and maybe one culture, you know, because the art is all the same, you know. But sometimes these cultural traits of the region play a role in helping these people rise to the top. But to me, that it was always about the achievement, not the nationality.
without a doubt. And I think, you know, like when you talk about the beef that people have had with you as it relates to the books come from the people who didn't read the books. I think, you know, that in as things spread, the politics of like tagging, oh, this person was born outside Brazil and all that. I think one of the advantages of that for the sport is to for people to see the umbrella growing, because I think you're exactly right. I feel like as a beginner, I didn't identify myself as such, but I'm an old beginner. Like I'm be 53 here in a month. Started when I was 50. But I feel like I'm coming at an interesting time of an explosion of awareness of jiu-jitsu, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I'm looking forward to watching this kind of roll out. But it seems to me that regardless of the fact that, yes, the achievement was the championship, the story, I think, mattered in opening it up, that this is not just a Brazilian thing. This is, you know, maybe it was at the beginning of it growing into the worldwide thing, that it is. At least that's, you know, that's something that I'm curious about. I spent 10 years in the CrossFit community, and I remember like 2004, 2005, Greg Glassman was running this, you know, site that was kind of quirky to look at, and then, you know, it progresses and Reebok sponsors it and it becomes, you know, this global thing. And it was an interesting thing to watch as an athlete. It was an interesting thing to watch as a business person, you know, as well. On a different podcast, I'm curious about 1975 when those rules changed, if there was a business component to that as well, is that if that affected sort of the way in which you could compete and you know, create tournaments, if that mattered, you know, if going to the ground as opposed to standing up had some relationship to like how many people could participate compared to, you know, if it had more of that judo focus.
You know, that's a very good question. I actually have a whole chapter about that. I mean, large portions of my book are about this commercialization of jiu-jitsu. And it's 75, you see the complete separation from traditional judo. That's the establishment of Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a ground-oriented art. It's crystal clear in the rule set. I don't see how anyone would think that's controversial. But as far as it becoming a business, most of these guys in those days didn't even pay. Like they didn't want. It was more about we want Spartans. We want you know, there's no money to be made anyway, so you might as well kick out the people who don't belong and just make it a very selective process. What these guys were talking about would start with, you know, you have a room, maybe out of 200, maybe 5 would stay. You know, most people couldn't because they're getting hit in the face, you know, every Friday or Saturday, just to remind them like what a fight would be like.
Right.
So it wasn't for everyone. The commercialization of jiu-jitsu or the democratization of jiu-jitsu, really, it begins after Royce. Once it comes to the United States, after 93 in the UFC, and it becomes, and I think a lot of these Brazilians that came over, I call it the Americanization of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by Brazilians. That's the name of the chapter.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
That's very cool.
Americanized it because when they got here, see, the American public was used to martial arts being commercialized. They were used to karate. They were used to taekwondo. So to them, making martial arts a commercial versus a Spartan practice was the norm. It was not unusual. When the first wave of Brazilians came here, they brought that Spartan ethos with them, right? Right away, they realized that was a terrible idea because the American parents, I lived that. We had the gauntlet, a little belt test with the kids, and I'm whacking the kids on the back. That's what we did in Brazil. And if you're gonna go home, if you're gonna, you're not for jiu-jitsu. That's simple. That's how they looked at it. That's what we looked at it. If you're not a warrior, if you can't have a belt, whack it back, and it's gonna be a bruise on your back tomorrow, well, boo-hoo, go home, cry. Oh, but he said, and right. That's, and that we did that. We were whacking these kids on the back, reasonably hard.
Oh, my gym was for the new belts and on birthdays. On the birthdays, you get smacked as well.
Too. That's what you get, a birthday gift, you get a back. It's a rites of passage, right? It exists in many warrior cultures to validate that culture. Right. You have to prove yourself, right? A warrior to belong to this tribe, right? You have to earn your place here, right? Well, the look on the parents' face told me everything. No, don't ever do that again. I didn't. I had a business. I had a lease on my name, or $500,000. I got to pay that lease.
Yeah.
So you have all these other concerns. So we Americanize it. So when I write about, Brazilians did, I include myself, though I do it with the guilty conscience because I think we watered down the product. And once you do that, we lose credibility. And I think we're in that process of becoming what we used to criticize. We're becoming Taekwondo. We're becoming the karate. The only thing I don't think we're ever going to get to the point, thanks to IBJJF for creating systems in time, right? We're not going to get to the point where we're going to hand over, black belts to 12-year-old kids. Right. But we were in that direction up to a few years ago. You guys may remember, there were people that are starting to do stuff like junior black belt, and that community went whoa, we can't do this. And IBJJF came in and created systems. So no, you have to be this age, X amount of years. But thank God they did that because it gave jiu-jitsu some order.
Yes.
But there's I think the commercialization process is inevitable given how popular it is.
Right.
But it's also, if we have learned anything from the history of martial arts, is that's the beginning of sort of we start going down in terms of credibility when that happens too. I compared Joe Rogan to Elvis Presley.
The prophet,
because he did that for karate, right? Elvis.
Yeah.
And everyone knows what happened after that. So it's good and bad. I make a comfortable living from jiu-jitsu because of it, but at the same time, we lost something too.
My first exposure to martial arts was in the early 80s, and I had a variety of experiences, and I had some people and I'm not, when I say exposure, I'm talking about being a kid, being a 10-year-old kid in a class. I'm not talking about becoming a champion in any way, shape, or form, but as a consumer of the commercialized, martial arts, I had access to a very traditional immigrant teacher for about a year. And then I went, who was teaching in the park and who would, if I could pay any money, I would pay it. And if not, and I had that experience. And then I had going to a mall and, strip mall and going and experiencing that. And they were two very different things. And I over time, thinking of it as learning gymnastics or dancing almost, rather than being a martial arts. And I actually don't have a quarrel with that. I think there's nothing terribly wrong with a kid looking to learn those things versus, learning to fight. However, the language and what are we learning here? I think needs to be clear, or what are we developing? I know you're going to have to go shortly. And so I got to conclude with one important question, because we are always encouraging people who have not tried jiu-jitsu to try jiu-jitsu, and for those who have begun jiu-jitsu to stay with jiu-jitsu. So we started this podcast with this idea in mind. So we wanted to ask you if you had a story of sort of where you saw jiu-jitsu having the most profound impact on a person. I'm sure you got many, many stories, but maybe you could pick one of jiu-jitsu coming into that person's life having a transformational relationship to that person. We're not looking for, it doesn't have to be like that they transformed into a champion per se, but perhaps just personally that it meant the most to them.
So I could tell you stories like that one for days. Over the
No
years,
doubt.
I've trained children with autism. They got off the drugs and off of therapy.
Wow.
Veterans with PTSD got off the drugs and off the therapy. Alcoholics, drug addicts,
Wow.
people with problems at home, abused children, you name it. And I've seen jiu-jitsu help them. But I'm going to tell you my favorite one. About maybe 8 years ago, I taught a seminar in the northeast of Brazil in a city called Caruaru. It's a city in the middle of nowhere. It's a historical town it's got some interesting history behind it. But I was there for a seminar. It turns out it's the middle of nowhere in Brazil. So no one thinks about teaching a seminar in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. But I went there because I was invited. We have an affiliate there. I had never been there before. I had heard so much about Caruaru that I'm like, I want to go. For Brazilians, é a terra do lampião. So that's and when I got there, it turned out to be the biggest seminar I ever taught in my life. It was me and Cavaca, my partner. We had like something like 250 people at the seminars. I've never taught a seminar even close to that big. Turns out that if you go somewhere where no one ever goes, all the people right? Which is kind of true. If I to go to California and teach, I get 20 people. I go to Arkansas and I get 50 people in the room. But so it's a big seminar of that. And there's this guy at the seminar called Hugo, and I'll never forget. It was his promotion to black belt, and he was a paraplegic.
Oh.
And Hugo's story got promoted to black belt. I got to know him a little bit better. But when he was a blue belt, he had just started training. He had one of those pull-up bars on his doorway in his bedroom. And I think the story when he came running at it and he jumped at it, and he grabbed the bar and his legs came forward. So right when his legs came forward, the bar detached. So he landed on his tailbone and broke his back. Right? So he was paraplegic, young guy, like maybe early 20s, and he, his family then was jiu-jitsu. But what was beautiful about the story is that he didn't look at, at him in a wheelchair as ending his jiu-jitsu journey. He stuck to jiu-jitsu. And I got to spend a week with those guys. And it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. I'll never forget the lesson. These guys, and he came from poverty. He was not a wealthy guy. He was in a poor, very simple house. That's where he lived. And people would pick him up. The jiu-jitsu guys would pick him up. And I did this every morning. They would pick him up. They would go to his bedroom. They would carry him into the car. They would get his wheelchair. They would fold it. They would put it in the trunk of the car. They would drive him to the gym. And then they'd pull out the wheelchair, carry him back on the gym, help him get dressed, carry him to the mats, train with him. Guy can't use his legs. He can't do a whole bunch, but he's training every day. Right. And at the end, they do the same thing. They go out to eat or take him home or whatever. And they did this every day. And Hugo was a part of the family like everyone else. And I'm watching all these guys doing that. I'm like, man, that's incredible. Like, how many people do that? You see people talking about moral righteousness and doing good and being kind. Be kind. And you hear all that.
Yeah.
But okay, you're talking about it. But what are you doing?
Yeah.
And these guys were doing it. And Hugo was the other thing about Hugo, he was the life of the party. Like everywhere, he was so happy and so funny. And then people would like crack jokes. And you would think the guy in the wheelchair, no one's ever going to make fun of that guy, right? Brazilians don't understand. Tearing the guy up, they make fun of him. You're like, holy cow, man, you can't talk shit to a guy in a wheelchair. And Hugo's firing back like with jokes and ripping them to pieces, man. That guy had a phenomenal sense of humor. And they're just going back and forth, talking shit to each other in the Brazilian style. And I'm like having the time of my life with these people. I'm like laughing. I'm like, man, this is one of the best groups of people I've ever met in my life. An amazing groups of people. And I think Hugo was sort of like, I don't know if the accident was the catalyzer to that. Right. But if Hugo's accident didn't just, I believe it changed Hugo. But I think the group around him too, they made him all better people for it. And man, I haven't been back since, but I always tell myself I want to go back because I actually really miss those guys in that place because I was only there for a week, but I had such an incredible, and it changed me in a sense.
Sure.
Because I'm watching people complaining, and everyone's a victim these days. I'm a victim. I'm a victim. It's like we've normalized victimhood like it's something glorious, and it's not. Yeah. And you're Hugo, a real victim, first of poverty, and then being
right.
And he's got a huge smile on his face, and he's happy, and nothing, and he doesn't feel like a victim.
Yeah.
And I thought it was such a powerful life lesson. So that's my favorite story of jiu-jitsu changing the life of not just one person, but of
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's
everybody.
so beautiful. And the notion that it's not, that the there's a single moment changes everything for one person, and then a whole group of people, are affected in a way that, as you say, some people are going to take the road to say, this is tragic and we're going to be only going to be sad about this. We're only going to let this, instead it becomes a catalyst for a tighter, deeper relationship to each other. And I mean, that's, we use that expression, as many do, jiu-jitsu is for everybody. And, that story couldn't exemplify it more. I know that you need to go, so we want to be respectful to the time that you need to end. But I have to tell you, this has been, I have loved this conversation. And so should you, be willing to come back, we would love to talk more with you. We know that this could sprawl on and on. So we always try and keep it pretty disciplined, so we don't end up eating up your whole day. But boy, this was a terrific conversation, and I'm really grateful you made time for us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. I would love to stay more. Typically, I block out 2 hours out of my day for a podcast or interview. But like someone scheduled a private, my friend does schedule a private, not knowing about the podcast. Give it 10 minutes. So I got to go. Otherwise, we can keep talking forever. It was a pleasure on my end as well. And yeah, maybe we can do this again in the future sometime soon.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks so much, Robert. Really appreciate it.
Anytime, guys. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.